Welcome. Uh, I am Jonathan Cole from Climate Action California, and we expect about 45 minutes for the presentation, and then the rest of the time will be for Q&A. To ask a question, use the Q&A feature in Zoom. You may see that at the bottom of your screen. You may need to hit the More button in order to make that come up, and then you can enter a question, and we'll answer questions, time permitting, at the end of the presentation. And we are going to be recording this. We are recording it, and the recording and the slides will be available in the next couple of days, and we'll send out links to everybody who is registered for the presentation. So first off, let's introduce ourselves. I'm Jonathan Cole. I am the Rail and Transit Lead for Climate Action California. Climate Action California is a grassroots legislative advocacy group, about 7,000 members in California and about 11,000 across the country. And we focus on the California State Legislature and on some of the state regulatory agencies. And I focus on rail and transit. In my previous life, I taught physics at Miracosta College in North San Diego County. And I also developed a climate course and co-authored 2 chapters in the University of California climate textbook called Bending the Curve. I've also got the link up here for our group, Climate Action California. If you're interested in volunteering, helping out, it's a fun and somewhat wonky group, but we try to do a lot of good work for the climate. And I'll pass it over to Carter to introduce himself.
Great. And fun and wonky, that's the best combo. My name is Carter Lavin, he, him. I'm the co-founder of the transit advocacy group, Transbay Coalition. We are transit advocates, street safety advocates throughout the 9 Bay Area counties. And I'm also the author of the book, If You Want to Win, You've Got to Fight, A Guide to Effective Transportation Advocacy, which is out by Princeton University Press, came out in November. So excited to be here with you all.
Okay. And over to Calvin.
Hi everyone, I'm Calvin Sridhara, a 10th grader at Leland High School in San Jose. I co-lead the San Jose in Transit teams at Silicon Valley Youth Climate Action, where we have been working to push for better, more accessible public transit across the region. Transit has been really central to a lot of our advocacy work this year, and I'm really glad to be here talking about it.
Great. Thanks, Calvin. And just to give you an outline, what we're going to talk about is what is a keystone species, why they matter, why we see transit as a keystone species with impacts on congestion, on housing, crucially, and of course on emissions, climate emissions. And we'll talk about all of those. And then we'll give you an update on what's happening currently with transit systems, including some of the threats to transit in the Bay Area and what you can do about it. So Carter will introduce the idea of the keystone species.
Sounds good. Thank you so much. So first off, just when we're talking about what is a keystone species, it is something that basically is a species without which the entire environmental ecosystem that's around it either collapses or drastically changes. So much like how a beaver significantly changes the area around it, whereas other flora and fauna in the area are important, but maybe don't have as big of an impact. So beavers are a classic one. Wolves, I know this is a very smart and wonky crowd, so there's a lot of stories about wolves and their importance of keeping ecosystems in balance so that plant life can grow and they're not overgrazed. Classic out here on the West Coast, we also have otters and their role in this. So it's basically something that fulfills a key role for the rest of the ecosystem to continue to flourish. So yes, while making this, I realize some of these examples are in the theme of predation, like a wolf and things like that. That's not exactly what we're talking about, but yeah. So Jonathan, you can keep moving us through. And so when we're talking about is transit a keystone species, first we have to talk about what its role in our ecosystem looks like. And one of the big things about transit's role in the ecosystem is, depending on how you look at it, has a kind of a small role. About 7 or 8% of all commute trips happen via transit in the Bay Area. That number is growing since the pandemic. It was growing beforehand. But when we're looking at it, it is not the majority of way that people get around, but it's still pretty impactful, as we can talk a little bit about. And even with that number, we're talking about 1 million transit trips every single day happening in the Bay Area. And what we were just talking about before was commute, but half of the trips that happen on transit are commute. The other half are through school, people getting to class, whether that's high schoolers like Calvin or people in college or grad school or beyond, people running errands, people going shopping, and then there's a segment of recreational, which is not necessarily people joyriding on BART or on the bus, although, beautiful bus rides out there. This is people more like my friend L right now, who's heading to Hadestown taking AC Transit. That's a recreational trip, not exactly an errand. And so it has this role where a lot of people use it in a lot of different ways.
And transit isn't just a way to get from point A to point B. It's really what holds the entire Bay Area region together. The Bay Area works because people, jobs, and neighborhoods are connected to each other. And for a lot of people, public transit is the only way to make that connection possible. And when you take transit away, a lot of what makes the Bay Area function starts to fall apart. And one thing that often gets overlooked is how transit changes the way we use space. When more people use shared transit, roads are less clogged, sidewalks are more walkable, and public space truly feels shared. Cars take up a lot of room both on the road and parked, and transit lets more people move through and live in the same space without cities breaking down. And when transit works, people also don't need to keep moving further out to find affordable space. That matters because sprawl isn't just ugly, it chews through open land, breaks up habitats, and makes our emission problem harder to solve. It truly hurts the ecosystem of the Bay Area. And keeping development closer in is a lot easier when people can actually get around without a car and through public transit.
And building on that idea of sprawl, sprawl and auto dependency go hand in hand. So we have built city structures so that people need a car to get to work, to get places in many locations. And that adds, first of all, the cost, especially for low income households, there's a significant cost, an increasing cost associated with owning a car, but it's a necessity. And then because we have constructed are these suburbs that sprawl out, auto dependency tends to promote large distances between housing, services, shopping. So things sprawl out more. The more they sprawl out, the more you become dependent on the auto. So this leads to this vicious cycle of, and this is of auto dependency and sprawl. And that in turn can lead to long commute times, freeway congestion, and emissions that we'll talk about later. We can contrast that with a kind of a virtuous circle. And again, we all agree we need more housing. It's very clear that we need housing in California. If we have improved transit, we can build more infill. Infill avoids that sprawl that Calvin was talking about. It means that you can have housing close to work, close to jobs. It reduces the need to drive. That then creates density that can support even better transit. And so we get a virtuous circle where increasing density improves transit, and that creates opportunities for infill housing. And this solves one of the big issues with housing. One of the objections a lot of times to infill housing is, well, where are those folks going to park? They're going to take up parking on my street. Where I'm going to get traffic congestion in my neighborhood. If we've got transit, that reduces significantly the car pressure, and that's what makes infill housing really work. And speaking of congestion, congestion is beginning to come back into San Francisco. It is, we know that congestion is a serious issue nationally. San Francisco, a recent study, this is from January, showed San Francisco is the third most congested area in the nation. And a lot of this is because people coming in for work for other purposes with their cars. And if we think about freeway commutes and congestion, with housing and sprawl, you get that drive until you qualify, where you just keep going farther and farther out to find a house you can afford, and that leads to congestion. And Calvin was kind enough to actually count in this image. There's 305 cars in this image. All of those folks, that's if we assume the average occupancy of about 1.5 people per car, that's about 450 people. All those folks could fit into one 9-car BART train with everybody seated. So the geometry is a huge issue. Transit, as Calvin was showing in the previous issue with the people on the street and the bus, transit really unlocks that geometry problem by being able to transport a large number of people in a very small space. It also provides a multimodal backup. Multimodal transportation is really important. We saw that just this last weekend when a large section of the Bayshore Freeway in San Francisco was closed down. Traffic problems, there was some traffic snarls, but it wasn't nearly as big as people had expected, in part because a lot of people took BART. And I ended up taking BART. I was on BART over to Berkeley over the weekend. Definitely noticed more people on the train. That's taking pressure and congestion off of the freeways. So next, Carter will talk a little bit more about what if transit, or Calvin, sorry, will talk a little bit more about what if transit had a larger role to play in our ecosystem.
So, taking a look at this pie chart, we can see that passenger vehicles, which are usually cars and small trucks, make up nearly 28% of all greenhouse gas emissions in the United States. That's the single largest source of any sector on this pie chart. So, if we're truly serious about cutting our greenhouse gas emissions, we have to talk about how people get around. The more trips we can shift from cars to public transit, the faster these numbers can actually come down. And Bay Area Rapid Transit, or BART, alone saves over 600,000 pounds of CO2 every single weekday. To put that in perspective, that's the equivalent of the amount of carbon a forest twice the size of San Francisco absorbs every single day. And that's just one agency out of the many in the Bay Area. Transit is already doing so much climate work for us right now, even before we start talking about improving it in the Bay Area.
So if we look at, this is for California, if we look at the emissions, transportation emissions are coming down. We are having success in reducing transportation emissions, but they're not coming down quickly enough. And they still, as Calvin was saying, are the highest single source of CO2 emissions in California. Our goal is to get those emissions 40% below 1990 levels by 2030 and reach carbon neutrality by 2045. But right now, we're not on track to meet those goals. And of course, one of the ways that we can reduce transportation emissions is through electric vehicles. And electric vehicles are crucial. They're a key part of reducing our emissions. We need to electrify our transportation, and we need to decarbonize our electricity sources to reduce the emissions. And we can see that there's been a lot of success in increasing the adoption of electric vehicles in California. On this chart, you can see that the adoption has gone from well under 100,000 in 2015 to about 1.5 million in 2024. Recent years, about 25% of all vehicle sales have been electric vehicles. And California has about a third of all electric vehicles in the nation. However, there's a time lag problem. We're up to about 25% of new vehicles being electric. But if we look at our existing fleet, this is registered vehicles at the end of 2024, we still have 88% are gasoline vehicles. Only 5% are battery electric. So even if we reach the goal of having all new vehicles electric by 2035, which was in an executive order from Governor Newsom, it will still be decades, at least 15, 20 years before the fleet is largely electric. So in addition to electrifying our vehicles, we need to reduce the total vehicle miles traveled. And we want to do that without without reducing our mobility. So transit is a key strategy for being able to preserve mobility while having fewer vehicles traveling fewer miles. There's a lot going on in this chart. If you focus on the dotted lines, those are per person vehicle miles traveled, and this is showing relative to 2001. 2001's picked because it was a baseline year that was used by the California Air Resources Board, CARB, to set its targets. And what we can see for both California in red and the US in blue is that there was some fluctuation, but not a lot of change until the pandemic. We see a drastic drop in vehicle miles traveled during the pandemic, and then an increase following the pandemic again. California didn't go back as much as the rest of the US did. A lot of that is because California has a higher percentage of folks who are working from home post-pandemic. So there's a lot of reason for this, but we're still going in the wrong direction. The targets that we need to reach in order to reach our overall emissions goals are those horizontal lines at the bottom of the chart. By 2030, we should be 24% below 2001 levels in our per person vehicle miles traveled. Right now, we're only 10% below, a little bit less than that. So we really need to be accelerating our efforts to meet the vehicle miles traveled targets for 2030 and 2045. And that will have a significant effect on our emissions. This is another version of the kind of picture that Calvin showed. This is one that was taken in Seattle several years back. And this is showing 200 people. Upper left-hand corner is in cars, 177 cars. And the lower right-hand corner is those same people on a bus. And again, this is the geometry problem that we've been talking about. This is why autonomous vehicles or rideshare or many of these other solutions, they don't really address congestion. The basic geometry of cars is they're always going to take up a lot of space. In this picture, they have 177 cars. I figured I'd be a little bit more generous and calculated for 1.5 people per car, which is the average in the US. That would mean 200 people would fit in 133 cars. And we can compare those emissions to the emissions from 3 buses using kind of standard emission factors. This is from the Bureau of Transportation Statistics. Carbon dioxide, about 1/10. So we can transport that same number of people, far less congestion, and about 1/10 of the carbon dioxide emissions. Also, lower emissions of pollutants that damage human health, including nitrogen oxides and particulates. Particulates, these are basically soot. Both of these have terrible negative effects on health. They're also climate warming emissions. Nitrogen oxide combines with volatile organic compounds to produce ozone, which not only damages health, but is also itself a climate warming agent. Particulates, dark particulates like soot, also absorb heat and warm the climate. And here we're looking at NOx would be about 1/15 as much. Particulates about 1/9 as much. So we've got a really significant reduction in emissions. And of course, if those buses were electrified, like the trolley buses in San Francisco, and getting power from carbon-free sources, the emissions would be practically zero. So this is where transit is key in reducing emissions, in reducing health-damaging pollutants, and in reducing congestion. There's a study which is nearly final. This is the proposed final version. It's going to come out in a final version very soon. This is part of the Bay Area's overall sustainable communities planning process. This is produced by the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, and this document is called Transit 2050 Plus. they propose a series of improvements to transit that, in their calculation, would increase the transit mode share for work. In the chart, we're seeing about 8%. That could go up to about 19%. And that would reduce vehicle miles traveled in the Bay Area by 4 million miles per day. This is by 2035 if the plan was implemented. And CO2 emissions would be reduced by 4 million pounds per day. If you remember, BART right now is already reducing 600,000 pounds per day. Here we're talking about 4 million pounds per day. So a very significant reduction of emissions. So over to Carter.
Yeah. And so, we're seeing, okay, transit is important. We're seeing that it can have these huge impacts. And we see that historically, if we're like, well, how do we get people out of cars? Currently, a global pandemic, which is ongoing, that's been one thing. We don't want that as a solution. So how would we like to make it easier for people to get around with driving less? And there's great news is there's a ton of solutions to this, and Transbay Coalition works on a lot of these things. So one is help people get around without any sort of motor vehicle at all or an e-bike. When your streets are safer for people who have walkers or wheelchairs or scooters or bikes or their own 2 feet to get around, they will do that. When there's more destinations within walking distance, whether that's a park or a grocery store or a corner store or a bus stop, it's easier for people to leave cars behind entirely, helps relieve congestion, makes our communities more vibrant places. And so things like protected bike lanes, uh, pedestrian refuge islands, all sorts of things, sidewalks, just sidewalks with ramps are really important, not just from a justice and a equities standpoint, but for making our system better. That is part of our transportation system. And when it comes to making transit better, the good news is there's a lot of things that we could do to make transit better. The number one predictor of whether or not people will switch to taking transit, regardless of car ownership, things like that, is service frequent. There's a lot of stuff out there about how if a bus runs every 15 minutes or more frequently, people use it very regularly. And the second you get longer, like a 20-minute wait, that's when you start getting to people saying, screw this, I'm going to figure out something else. Another big part is making sure transit service runs to more places. And this is something we see a lot in the paratransit world, people with disabilities. But, can transit literally get you where you need to go? In the Metropolitan Transportation Commission has put out some new signage, and one thing it highlights is transportation to green spaces. I think people talk a lot about how do you get to nature? And in Oakland, where I live, there's a lot of bus routes that get you to the regional parks and things like that. We need that to be more common so that people can live more of their life through transit. Another part is reducing transit times. I'm still on the other thing, if you don't mind. Uh, Reducing travel times for transit. So if you're like, great, the bus is good, it's frequent, all that stuff, and it still just takes you forever because you have to be stuck behind a schmo driving a single person in one car, that's rough. But there's all sorts of things that we can do to get buses out of the general traffic, moving a lot faster, whether that's a bus only lane, things like bulb outs so that buses don't have to pull in and out of traffic. And one of my favorite ones, signal prioritization. Really nerdy. Basically, buses always get green lights. If buses always get green lights, they move a lot quicker. And then there's a lot going on, which Calvin's group's talking about like helping people understand how to use transit, much like how people learn to walk, learn to bike, learn to drive. Learning how to use transit is a thing. Lots of stuff about signage and wayfinding that's coming up, and then making the experience more comfortable, which are great news. Great news about that is you know, that can be bus shelters and all this fancy stuff, but sometimes it's as simple as a bus bench. And the Bay Area is really fortunate to have a crew of folks who've been taking it upon themselves to build benches at bus stops. I think they've done over 120 bus stops in about 5 counties. So lots of things that we can do to make transit better at the big and small scale. And as part about this, one thing that we've talked about before at different times when we talk about who rides transit, a lot of times people say, well, the people who take transit, people who don't have any other options. These are families who don't have a car. And yeah, when you're looking at who rides the bus, 74% of people do not have access to a car in their household. That means 25% of people do. That there are 50% of folks, a huge number of people who do have other options and they choose transit. And so the more that we make transit better and easier for folks, the more that people leave cars behind, take transit. So we do show that people have who take transit have options a lot of times, and it's also really important for the people who don't. So I'll pass it to Calvin. Maybe that's still me. Never mind.
Yes.
And so, sorry. Um, and so there's this big question of like, okay, well, if transit is this keystone species, if it could even be a greater keystone species, what happens if it goes away? And it's like, well, we see what happens in any ecosystem where a keystone species goes away. Really bad things. So, for example, if we keep moving through, when we're talking
Yeah.
about, yes, a lot of people take transit because they choose to, because it's great. Okay. And there's a lot of people who don't have a car. And so if transit's not an option, that is a lot of people in the Bay Area who all of a sudden, who were kind of invisible in our transportation system if you just live your life by the highways and live your life by parking lots, like those people are about to become extremely visible in your life because they are people who will figure out how to get a car. And maybe it's a janky car that breaks down a whole lot, but it's still something. So without transit, we see a lot more cars on the road, which also means we can go keep moving through. As we were talking about this image, for every time a BART train doesn't exist, there's one more picture of this. For every time BART goes away, there's one more of that. And so we're going to say, well, maybe it's a 3% service cut or a 10% cut or anything like that. Like there's just some maintenance costs, some temporary maintenance happening in BART Transbay Tube. Pretty soon they're talking about lowering service. Like, okay, well, that's that many cars that are going to be out there. And that's not great for anybody. So we can keep going. And, that's we've looked at studies about what would happen if there were significant cuts to BART. They're talking about 12 more hours of travel time of traffic per week for folks. This is particularly bad for folks out in, I mean, kind of everywhere. Contra Costa County, where I spend a lot of my time, is particularly in trouble with the Caldecott Tunnel. There's a lot of areas. One thing, as Calvin very beautifully said, our community is defined by our transportation, and the Bay Area is a place where we have bridges and we have tunnels, which are great and connectors, and they're also massive choke points. And so, like the Bay Bridge and the Caldecott Tunnel in particular, without BART service, would face big cuts. I don't know if you can keep going. Yeah, we're looking at a just massive increase in traffic in these areas, which also, as we saw in New York City with the congestion fee resulting in lower transit, or sorry, lower car usage in the areas around it. Like when there's high traffic, like when the Caldecott Tunnel is trafficy, Fish Road becomes more trafficy. People who go to the overflow, cars as water continue to flow. And so a big thing that we need to do is keep our transit system running so we don't have this um, flood of cars on the road.
And sadly, the scenario of a transit system collapse is not hypothetical. As we mentioned, Bay Area, the commute mode share for transit is relatively small, but part of the reason that it dropped and has not come back to previous levels is because of the pink line on this graph, which is work from home. We see an increasing number of people working from home, not taking transit. So at first glance, you might say, okay, well, there are fewer people taking transit, therefore we don't need as much transit, so let's go ahead and cut it. The problem is that the drop is primarily in that heavy commuter crush in the morning. People take transit throughout the day for all kinds of reasons, and the decrease in transit is much less during the rest of the day. On weekends, in many lines, service is actually, or user ridership is actually increased on weekends and during the weekday. A couple of the lines I ride very frequently, the 22 Muni and the 49, actually have more riders now than they did before the pandemic, in part because service has increased. And when you increase service, as Carter was saying, you can get more users. But the loss of commuters has led to significant funding gaps for all of the transit agencies in the Bay Area. These are the four major transit agencies in the Bay Area. Each of them are looking at a loss of a significant portion of their operating budget. And this is for different reasons. BART was pre-pandemic one of the best systems for what's called fare recovery. No transit system, no transportation system operates without some form of subsidies, but BART was getting over 70% of its income from fares. A lot of that coming from that commuter rush, the jam-packed trains that we had going in and out of central San Francisco at commute times. Muni has had a cut for both a drop in commuter ridership, but also because Muni happens to get a lot of its fares from parking fees. So when folks were not driving in as much for work, there was a loss of parking fees. So for a variety of reasons, the pandemic and then the switch to work from home have seriously hit these agencies. There's been a series of federal and state loans to state grants to prop this up, ending most recently with a bridge loan from the state to Muni and BART for this year, which is what's keeping them going right now. Without that, we would be looking at serious cuts already. However, this bridge loan was the last one, and without additional funding, we're looking at really serious cuts. Muni met with a budget meeting yesterday and confirmed these scenarios from an earlier budget workshop. They're talking about having to cut up to 20 routes, including a lot of the local neighborhood connectors and some of the routes that go into downtown. And then on the remaining routes, basically cut service frequency in half. And on this slide, they express it as double wait times, but it doesn't just mean you have to wait twice as long for a bus. It means that when you get on, it's going to be much more crowded because everybody who had to wait longer is going to be jamming onto that bus. It means it's going to be slower to get from one location to another because you have to allow more time for the folks to get on and off that crowded bus. So that will create slower bus times. And as Carter was saying, folks who have other means will get their own car or they'll use rideshare. And that will increase traffic congestion even more. Similar scenarios for BART. This is a map that was put out by BART earlier this year. They've since kind of pulled back on this because they said, well, we don't really want to say for sure which stations are targeted. We're just going to say it's this number of stations. But if you look at ridership and kind of logical patterns, it's going to be something like this. Each red X on this map represents a BART station that would close. It would go from 5 lines to 3, from 3 trains per hour on each line to 2, system probably closing at 9 p.m. And one of the problems with an agency like BART, where you have a large rail system, it's expensive just to maintain the rail and keep it going. So if you need to, say, cut 20% of your budget, you may have to cut 40 or 50% of your service because you have fixed costs associated with maintaining the system. And in fact, this is not the worst case scenario. This is what they would be looking at in mid-2027. It's questionable whether they could raise enough revenue on this system for BART to continue operating. So the next phase would actually be a complete shutdown of revenue service. And a lot of people say, oh, this sounds like fear mongering, but this is a real possibility. This is a realistic possibility looking at the income for BART. And this is just showing ridership relative to 2019. I call it a tale of two systems because the point I'd like to make here is first, the blue line is BART showing the sharp drop recovery, but still only at about 50% of pre-pandemic levels. Not because ridership is less through the day. If you ride BART, you see that the trains look about as crowded in the middle of the day as they ever did. We're just missing that big crush of commuters that was subsidizing BART. Caltrain, interestingly, followed a similar trajectory to BART, but then we get this sharp increase. And the reason for this is in 2024, Caltrain was able to electrify its fleet. Those electrified trains, they run faster, which means you can actually, because it takes less time to travel the route, you can actually have more trains per hour. They especially increased weekend service. They're smoother, they are cleaner, they are more pleasant. So, for all kinds of reasons, the electrification pulled in a lot more riders. And this shows that there is demand out there. If you provide faster, better service, more frequent service, you can increase your ridership. And Caltrain is up to about three-quarters of pre-pandemic ridership. But they are also facing this fiscal cliff. So they are looking at shutting down the weekend service that they just expanded and then starting to close stations. So similar to BART. So we are facing a real serious crisis for the major Bay Area transit agencies at this point. And so Carter will talk about what we can do to protect this endangered species.
Yeah. The good news about transit as an issue is it is fairly straightforward. As we're talking about, like, well, how do we get people riding it more? It's like, well, like we saw with Caltrain, you improve service. So thank you to the California High-Speed Rail, which electrified Caltrain and got service up. When we add bus stop benches, we increase service. But a big thing, reason why we're talking about these big numbers and these gaps is that effectively California, the state of California, doesn't really fund transit that much compared to its peer states. That compared to like Illinois and other places, our state only has relatively recently started funding transit. And a lot of that funding has not been going to Bay Area large operators. It's been other stuff. Like it's been kind of LA has recently started funding its stuff, and we are lagging. So as we could see here, BART, SFMTA, AC Transit, Caltrain, the big kind of four, they've been getting about 10% of their funding from uh, federal and state agencies and support, whereas other agencies across the country get a lot more support. So why is this happening? Because public transit's underfunded in California. So we got some good solutions here. And Jonathan can point us to. And that's the Connect Bay Area measure is the big one that we're looking at right now. So this would be a five-county measure. It would raise about $1 billion a year, every year for the next 14 years, which is a huge amount of money. It plugs a lot of these gaps. It goes to all the transit operations in all of those five counties. So we're talking paratransit, we're talking Tri-Delta Transit and Samtrans, VTA, County Connection, agencies that some of you just heard their names for the first time right now as I said that. And some of you may have been like lived in the Bay Area for 40 years and haven't had the joys of riding on these systems. This is all of these agencies because as we're talking about, this is a systemic issue. And this would be funded through, it'd be in San Francisco, a 1% sales tax and SF because, as Jonathan mentioned, Muni's in particular trouble, and it'd be 0.5% sales tax in the other counties. Um, so a person making minimum wage would spend about $8 a month. I've been gathering a lot of signatures for this measure as I like to talk to people. I just bought a pair of new shoes, fancy, fancy shoes, $70. They'd be $70.35 so I could walk to BART rather than walk to San Francisco. And what this measure does is provide significant long-term funding. And if you can move to the next slide, it shows about it. It protects us from these service cuts. It improves service in a lot of areas. There's some particularly cool stuff around paratransit that gets us a lot closer to that one-seat ride. That's a big issue in the paratransit world. It also helps improve service through a lot of things like better wayfinding and the discount program, like the transfer discount program that just went through, that didn't get a lot of attention, but it is saving people in the Bay Area about $1,000 a year if you switch from buses to BART or between agencies. And this obviously then helps avoid these traffic increases and the emission increases, the air quality decrease, the asthma tax, and keeps our economy growing and going and growing. And so this is a really big way of helping this kind of keystone species in this ecosystem help it continue to exist. And when we're looking at it, if you can bring it next part, it also, because of what this is as a funding source, is operations funding. So when people say, "Oh, I wish there was a janitor here," or "Someone should fix that light bulb," those are all operations costs. Those are all like maintenance, day-to-day costs. And those are particularly the things that are underfunded. So our systems will be cleaner, more accessible, better signage, and more integrated within each other so that your Muni and your BART train arrive with enough time for you to actually do that transfer at Embarcadero, which takes 2.5 minutes, depending on how fast or how slow you walk. I'm a slow walker, going from the K line to BART. And same thing when you're doing the bus transfer, you're going from BART to VTA or Caltrain to VTA. There's a lot of syncing up these agencies that this measure will help increase, which will help the kind of keystone species do what it does best of connecting us, do that even more. And a big part about that is these kind of improvements to how the system functions. So as I mentioned before, one of my favorite things is buses always get a green light. This measure will help pay for a lot of these types of improvements. And so things like signage. The other day I was at 19th Street BART. When we got out of the BART, she asked me where the 12 bus was. I was there, I was able to answer the question, but generally speaking, as a wayfinding solution goes, having the head of a transit advocacy group standing at every BART station to give you direction is not like the most, I mean, I'm happy to do it, but that's not exactly like the most cost-effective way of doing it. But having clear signs so a person knows what to look for, like MTC has recently done this big sync up of agencies so that, maybe you're in Dublin Pleasanton a lot and you're used to seeing the signs over there um, for wheels, and you're like, okay, well, if you're in Samtrans territory, if the signs look the same, you're like, I know what to look for a bus sign. Here you go. A lot of things about fare and payment make that a lot easier, make that a lot simpler, and improving accessibility so more people can get on it.
And Calvin will talk a little bit how you can help.
So now Jonathan, Carter, and I have made the case for why transit matters. Now the question is, what can all of you guys do? The good news is that there is a real concrete action available right now, and it has a deadline. Here is what we're asking for. This Connect Bay Area measure, it is a citizens initiative, which means it gets on the ballot through signatures and not politicians. And we need over 200,000 signatures from registered voters across this five-county region by early June. And if we hit that number, it goes to voters in November, where it only needs a simple majority to pass. And this is truly a case where one of your signatures can actually make a difference. And the most immediate thing you can do is sign the petition. If you are a registered voter in Alameda, Contra Costa, San Francisco, San Mateo, or Santa Clara County, please sign this petition. And after that, talk to people, neighbors, coworkers, your family. The measure needs visibility and support to build momentum. And if you have time, volunteering to collect signatures is the most impact you do. And Carter does this practically every single day, volunteering to collect signatures. And you can keep up with this measure and track everything at connectbayarea.com.
Yeah, and some of you might even be involved with an organization. And so if your organization has not yet endorsed the measure, please go to connectbayarea.com. There's a big endorse button, and you can join lots of unions, lots of climate groups, lots of environmental justice groups, immigrant rights groups, lots of fun folk, and add your name and be part of this. If you're looking for where are those events, where are those things, the get involved button, sign up. We'll start sending you emails about that kind of stuff. We're at a lot of farmers markets. I've been spending a lot of time at farmers markets. Always nice. Um, and yeah, we're excited to work with you on all this stuff. And lastly, to be very clear as well, Muni is in particular need. So while the regional measure helps fund Muni and BART and Caltrain and all the other agencies, Muni itself will still be in a big budget deficit unless we pass Stronger Muni for All, which is a specific a Muni specific one just in San Francisco. So we need both. I know sometimes there's like the good measure and the bad measure and the dialysis measure. We keep voting on dialysis for some reason. I think we're not voting on dialysis again this year. That was just like 8 years in a row. But this is one of those things where we need both the regional measure and the local measure for it to keep going together.
So thanks so much for attending. Hopefully, we've convinced you that transit really is a keystone species for so many things, including housing, congestion, and especially climate emissions in the Bay Area. And thanks for your interest and for helping to preserve transit in the Bay Area. And with that, we'll open it up for questions. And let's see. So we've got several questions here, and I'll just go through and we'll kind of toss around. First question is, how does infill housing support transit? Primary way infill housing supports transit is just by providing the density, providing the bodies that can ride transit. There are certain densities. For example, a subway, you need about 45 people per acre to make a subway successful. So the more you have dense housing, the more riders you have for transit, the more support you've got, and therefore the more transit can be built.
This also,
It's yeah. Go ahead.
yeah, and the other part about this, as the question also hits on, of like, since transit is largely not self-funded, much like how roads are completely not self-funded, how does density work out? So one is like if the bus is running anyway, the 72 bus and the AC Transit is going to run. And if there's another five people on it because there's another apartment building, like that's good. That makes everything a little bit more efficient. That helps lower the per passenger emissions for everything. Good all around, a little bit more money in the till. And then also, yeah, to this point, like that also does help build greater political constituencies around areas. And I think one thing to kind of Jonathan's point, density also makes it a lot easier for agencies to serve new areas that don't have it. So, for example, I was talking to a person out in Vallejo who's, really wants bus service in her community. And it's just one of those things where her community is like really far out. It's far from central Vallejo. There's a lot of people. And if all those people were at, within 5 square blocks, it'd be very easy for a bus to come up, like we stop here, people get on, we go, kind of like small towns in rural Europe type of thing. But when it's all sprawling out, there's like, well, people can't really walk to the stop or they can't crutch to the stop, things like that. So when you have sprawl, even if you do want to serve it by transit, you need a lot more bus stops per person, which adds costs and times and makes the system a lot harder for everybody else.
Another question: how do you think the repeal of California's EV mandate will impact public opinion towards future transit? Well, actually, the EV we still have the executive order to that in place for all new sales to be EV by 2035. What we have lost is the federal incentives of about $7,500 per vehicle. That seems to mostly be affecting attitudes towards gasoline versus EVs. It makes it a little bit less of a push for people to go towards EVs. Although, of course, the recent gas price spikes have created an incentive towards EVs again. The transit use, I don't know if Carter, if you've got a different view on this. There's not a strong I don't see a strong impetus in the EV versus internal combustion debate towards or away from transit.
Yeah, I
It's
mean, yeah, the way I think about that is, so I ride an EV pretty frequently, and I often do it with about several hundred other people. Like Bart's an electric vehicle, and I think when we talk about EV mandates as someone who would very much like an e-bike. I am, riding my acoustic bike, but there's some hills in the world and I'm a sweaty guy. It'd be nice to have an e-bike. I think one of the big things is like when we're talking about electric vehicles, we often aren't actually talking about electric vehicles. We're very talking about electric cars. And I think one thing that would be very of interest would be, something like for a person, for example, who maybe lives in an area says, look, I don't want an electric car, but I would like to, like, I have the state grant. If I bought an electric car, if I said, hey, Elon Musk, I would like to give you money, the state of California would say, yep, we're going to happy to chip in. We'll get him some money to give to Elon Musk. It's like, what if someone said, I would like to put my credit towards BART? I'd like to put my credit towards Muni. I'd like to prep my credit towards something else. And so I think, when it comes to electric vehicle policy, we could have a much smarter electric vehicle policy that would do really great in terms of reducing emissions, in terms of getting increasing mobility. Um, But currently, right now, the policy is essentially, hey, let's send Elon Musk a bunch of money. And I think we could do a little bit better than that.
Yeah, and there is a proposal. The governor has a proposal to put $200 million towards EV subsidies to partially replace the federal subsidies that disappeared. However, the source they're looking for is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which also funds transit. And so there's some skepticism in the legislature right now of whether that would divert money from transit. So that's still kind of working its way through the process.
Yeah.
Have another question. Why has there not been a more concerted effort for congestion pricing in San Francisco? I'll start, and then
Sure.
Calvin or Carter, you can jump in. There, recently, of course, we've had the problem with the pandemic of people worrying that weren't enough people coming to San Francisco. Now, obviously, we are seeing congestion coming back. For Muni, again, it's a two-edged sword because Muni actually gets more money from parking revenues than it does from fares. But I think that what we've seen is that congestion price in New York has been very successful in both reducing the amount of traffic coming in, reducing congestion, and raising money, which goes primarily for transit, for the subway system. Congestion pricing that would fund transit in San Francisco, I think there may be another push, another more momentum towards it, seeing how successful it's been in New York.
Yeah. Well, and I think also to this point, one thing that's very interesting about San Francisco is in a lot of ways there are various forms of congestion pricing. So parking fees are a form of congestion pricing. Specifically, they're a, hey, if you stop your car here, you got to pay money. Parking fees are very low. I know in Oakland, where I live, there's now parking fees on Sundays, things like that are starting to get enforced. But one part about that is like, well, that is part of the congestion pricing. I know there's a lot going on with parking politics in San Francisco, um, what's going on, but that is part of that. The other thing is from two of the three approaches into San Francisco, from the North Bay and from the East Bay, with bridge tolls, there effectively is congestion pricing. Now, there's a whole other county or two other counties, depending on how you're getting there from the South Bay, that do not pay a bridge toll. And maybe there's something saying that needs to be fixed. And so I think one thing to the question of, and the last part is MTC's 2050 plan that Jonathan talked about actually is looking at congestion pricing. So that's the other part. So I think for the technical answer to that, yes, there's a lot of ways that this is kind of being looked at. And from the political angle of that question of like, why aren't people doing it? There's a lot of ways to push that still get you a lot of the very similar effects. And those are slightly easier lifts. But we welcome you to join in. If you want to join
Yeah.
Transbay and say, "Hey, I really want to put your shoulder to the wheel on that," like, great, get involved.
Another question: if you didn't get its whole budget from fares anyway, why cut service? Why not just increase funding from other public sources? Well, yeah. Do you want to take that one, Carter?
Sure. So if San Francisco wanted to take half of the police budget and put it into Muni, that would almost solve Muni's gap. Now, I assume I'm not a San Francisco resident, so I can't speak to, I've never run for a citywide office in San Francisco. I haven't talked to everyone in San Francisco. I assume that taking half of San Francisco Police Department's budget and putting into Muni would at least have a couple of people asking a couple of follow-up questions. That is the scale of the problem that we are talking about. There is no, oh, well, if we get a little bit from here, or maybe the library hours shorten a little bit, and, do we really need to clean up the parks that often? When we're not looking at that and we're saying, well, we should take the money from X and put it to Y, we are looking at half of a police department's budget. That being said, maybe that is a better use of funds. I leave it to the San Franciscans to have that conversation and organize locally around it. But the other big part is unless the money comes through in January, these cuts happen now. And so Transbay Coalition, which had been very involved in the fights for many years to get state funding, get the grants, get the loans, get the this, we have successfully like kicked the can down the road. We have not been able to win consistent statewide funding for transit operations, things like that. We've got, we only were able to win $1 billion once and only able to win nearly $600 million as a loan another time, which is a lot of money to win. Took a lot of work. And so one part about it is while there are lots of great solutions, technically speaking, to transit and how to fund it, unless that money comes through in January, we are looking at this catastrophic collapse. And so the good news about the future is it keeps going. So Transbay Coalition, we've been around for 6 or 7 years, depending how you can, we'll continue to be around. And so once we have consistent funding for 14 years, that does give breathing room to say, okay, now let's talk about X, let's talk about Y, let's talk about all the different ways to improve transit service, improve the financial health of these agencies, from installing a lot of benches to making better signs to maybe redirecting money to from different city departments.
And I am a San Francisco resident, so I would just add that we're facing a serious crunch in city funding. They're already cutting positions, so there's not a lot of money within the city budget to direct towards this problem. So, yeah, I think if we state funding, and that kind of leads into how do we move the needle from on the states and the feds providing more funding for transit operators. I think the big answer, just I'll take a first stab, is the moving the political needle. Right now, we have a federal administration that is fairly hostile to transit in general and to California specifically. So that's an issue. And frankly, Governor Newsom is very opposed. He fundamentally feels that the state should not be funding local transit, that should be a local responsibility. So who is in the governor's office, who is in Washington matters, and that's
Well,
kind of how you move the needle. But
and a
Carter.
big part about this, which is why Transbay Coalition exists to organize on the 9 county region, and why also this is the longest I've gone before since mentioning my book, which just came out in November. If you want to win, you got to fight. Like we need more advocates in more parts of the country, more parts of the Bay, and more parts of the state. Because just to take San Francisco as an example, great to have a state senator who's really supportive of transit in San Francisco. That's one state senator. That is not enough to pass major legislation. It's good. It's much better to have one champion than to not have a champion. But when you're talking about how many votes do you need, we need people pushing, like what we have, what Calvin and others are doing, like pushing in San Jose for better bus service in San Jose. We need people in Gilroy saying, "Hey, we want to electrify Caltrain out to Gilroy." We need people in Fresno pushing for more funding for the facts out there. We need people all over, and that's how you win the big stuff that we got to organize and fight, and we have to spread, the people in Vallejo doing this stuff. Because if transit is viewed as, oh, those San Francisco or those Oakland or those Berkeley people keep wanting their money, not, oh, that's those everybody needs it, we're going to keep being kind of at the kids table. No offense, Calvin, the teen table, the youth table.
Yeah,
We're
and I
Go
also
ahead, Calvin.
wanted, oh, yeah, I also wanted to add if we were wanting to move the needle, especially on state funding, um, the more people that rely on transit, it's going to be harder for the legislators to defund it. And measures like the Connect Bay Area measure, that we mentioned in our presentation matter here like a lot because demonstrating that local communities will tax themselves for transit sends a message to the state and even the federal government that this is worth their time and effort.
Well,
So,
and also to give a quick shout out to Calvin's work in East San Jose, one big part about that is helping more people use the system, or helping more people realize that it is for them. So, big shout out to Calvin's work there.
We're running right up on 8 o'clock. One question that might be quick, and I'll let you take this, Carter, if you want, is how many signatures do you have so far?
Not 200,000. So come out and sign and come out
Yeah.
and signature gather with us. I
Okay.
personally have 1,775, I believe.
Yeah, which
So
is, I think, just about the top of the volunteer list. So
I would love to
it's
not be at the
amazing.
top though. So come crush me. Uh,
All right. With that, I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we'll need to close. This session has been recorded, and we will be sending out a link to both the recording and the slides within the next couple of days. So, with that, thanks everybody so much for attending. Carter or Calvin, any last words?
Thanks so much for having us. Happy Earth Day. Happy Earth week and month and year and decade and century and millennia. I'm so excited to keep working with you all to make transit better for everyone throughout the Bay. And reach out, get involved. Transbay Coalition.